Hello, YouTube friends. Jamie Hepworth here. Today, I want to talk with you a little bit about First Nephi chapter 16 in the Book of Mormon. I'm going to link to this chapter in the show notes below. Now, in this chapter, Nephi has just finished speaking to his brothers about his interpretation of the dream that he had and his experience with the tree of life, and his brothers are having a hard time with it. It says that they tell him, "Thou hast declared unto us hard things more than we are able to bear." Nephi does not sugarcoat anything. It says, "And it came to pass that I said unto them that I knew that I had spoken hard things against the wicked according to the truth, and the righteous have I justified, and testified that they should be lifted up at the last day. Wherefore the guilty taketh the truth to be hard, for it cutteth them to the very center." So he's basically saying, yeah, brothers, you're righteous. You need to repent. Is this the most helpful strategy? I don't know, but we could definitely say that Nephi is direct. And he encourages them to repent. He says, if you were righteous and you were willing to hearken to the truth and give heed unto it, you might walk uprightly before God. Then you would not murmur because of the truth and say, thou speakest hard things against us. This is a dynamic I see in people disagreeing a lot, is that tension between wanting to help communicate truthful principles that will help people actually come closer to God, and the difficulty of being able to hear things that maybe we're not quite ready to hear or we don't want to understand yet. It says, and it came to pass that I, Nephi, did exhort my brethren with all diligence to keep the commandments of the Lord. And this worked this time anyways. It says that they humbled themselves before the Lord, and Nephi was joyful and had hope that they were going to continue to walk on the paths of righteousness. Now, this again brings up a reference to Lehi dwelling in a tent in the valley of Lemuel. So this reference to the tent is, again, to me, signifying that this is a temple text, that there's something about temple worship that is being communicated in the Book of Mormon. This is something I'm particularly looking for this round, because for the people that I know and some of the questions that they're having, they tend to center around the idea of the temple and how that ties into the doctrine of Christ, and how the Book of Mormon ties into the temple and the doctrine of Christ. They are all related. I think it's really interesting in verses 7 and 8, it talks about how they marry the daughters of Ishmael, that Nephi takes one of the daughters to wife, and his brethren also take daughters to wife, and Zoram, the servant of Laban who came into the wilderness with them, also took a wife. So they're all taken care of. In verse 8, I think there's a lot of depth here in verse 8. And thus my father had fulfilled all the commandments of the Lord which had been given unto him. And also I, Nephi, had been blessed of the Lord exceedingly. I think that that verse lets us know that Nephi really likes his wife a lot. Verse 8, though, the first part of it, talking about his father had fulfilled all the commandments. I think this is literal in that God sent these boys back to go get the scriptures. And then God also instructed Lehi to send them to go get Ishmael's family so that they could have families that perpetuated on in this wilderness and eventually in the promised land. Sometimes people talk about this idea, is marriage in God's scheme of things actually that important, or is it just about coming to the bridegroom? Do we need families that go on forever? To me, this verse is a subtle hint that all of the commandments, this isn't just for Lehi, I think this is for everybody. All of the commandments need to be fulfilled, right? We need to have spouses in the covenant and fulfill all the things that God asks us to fulfill. I did a short study on a phrase that's brought up in the temple, but it's not necessarily communicated in the standard scriptural canon. But there's at one point when Eve is talking to Adam and she says, are you going to keep all of God's commandments? And it's really a call to fatherhood and to supporting her and being with her, and being able to have posterity. And to me, the essence of the fullness of the priesthood is tied into this idea of not only having a spouse and having the benefits of a family in the covenant, but also understanding that sort of spiritual aspect of what does it mean to have spiritual children, to be a spirit father, spirit mother to other people. I think it's encapsulated in the essence of Jesus inviting people to feed his sheep and to feed his lambs, and that he becomes a father to us. What does that mean? It's to help bring God's divine nature within, to express that, to live that, and to do that with other people in such a way that Christ can literally be with us, that we can literally come into the presence of spirit parents. But I think it also means that we have man and women together and families together who can fulfill God's purposes. And that's part of fulfilling all of God's commandments. It's not only something, spirituality is not enough. Religiosity, even by ourselves, is not enough. We need to do this with other people to fulfill all of God's commandments. In verse 9, it talks about how they were commanded to go into the wilderness again through Lehi. And the next morning they wake up and they find this ball, this compass, and it's called the Liahona, of course. And they're very astonished at it. It's not made after the pattern of man, and the things that they had understood. But there were two spindles, and one was pointing where they should go. Maybe one was like a constant, and then one's saying, hey, this is where you should go in relation to this. To me, I see a lot of imagery in this section, of kind of that ball and compass, the circle and the square. To me, that's masculinity and femininity coming together. But a lot of symbolism from the temple is tied into this idea of circles and squares and what those eternally mean. And I definitely see that here. You know, we think about the square is in a format, and I'll kind of reference this later because we've got the whole bow story in this section, but the square is masculinity, it's priesthood, it's authority, it's correctness, it's justice. And the feminine aspect is this round, it's faith, it's being led and not knowing beforehand what needs to happen, but being willing and receptive to what God needs to tell you to do. Anyways, so they've got this great little compass and it tells them where to go. And they are getting ready to go into the wilderness. They prepare all of these seeds. Again, I see like the square and the compass in this. To me, seeds get planted in earth, which is round. The seed is planted direct, you know, like it's information that's got a direction oriented towards life. So I see that in their preparation to have seeds of every kind. And it also reminds me of the story of the Garden of Eden. We're seeing like the days of creation start to play out and what needs to happen. It says, and it came to pass, we took our tents and departed in the wilderness across the river Laman. And talks about the direction they're traveling and that they come to a place called Shazar. Try to do a little bit of research about the name of Shazar, and there's some conflicting ideas about what it means. Some people think it means like twisted, like it could be an acacia tree grove. Some Hugh Nibley talks about it being a like forest or woody or treed area. A pass of the trees is what he suggested it might be. I think this idea of it being a pass of trees is interesting, and it makes sense also when you read in verse 14. It talks about how the Liahona guides him through the most fertile parts of the wilderness, which were in the borders near the Red Sea. So it's by water. It makes sense that there's going to be lots of trees. But this idea of the tree of life imagery that we've just seen in the passage beforehand, and now we're seeing this idea of they're learning something about, you know, spiritual things in this place of trees. Trees to me hold a sort of mysterious wisdom about important topics. They can also be kind of dark and something to figure out. It's something to navigate. So they're navigating this, but they're being led in the most fertile parts. But we see here that in verse 18, The family encounters a difficulty. Excuse me, I need some water. The family encounters a difficulty when Nephi's steel bow breaks. This is how they were able to eat, was they were able to hunt with this bow. To me, what this symbolizes is a breakdown in the understanding, a breakdown in the earthly methods of providing that they had experienced up until this point. And to me, this is an essential part of spiritual progression, is that we have these ideas that these, like, something man-made is going to provide the solution for me, and it's gone. It's gone, and what are they going to do with it? In verse 23, it talks about how Nephi decides to make a bow out of wood. And I just think that's interesting. I see the juxtaposition between the fine steel and the wood. And in this grove of trees, it's like, okay, well, this is the option. Like, what are we going to do? We're in this wilderness. Are we going to go and be part of the great and spacious building and rely on these things and say, this was all a bunch of messed up stuff, which is basically how the family responds in a big way. But Nephi decides, no, he's going to do something about this. Talks about how they're really hungry, though. They're fatigued. They're really suffering for the want of food. His brothers are murmuring. Even his dad, Lehi, is starting to murmur, and people are really, really getting sad. And it says their bows lost their springs. I'm sure there's some really interesting things we could deduce from this idea of the springs being lost too. It's citing Genesis 49:24. I didn't look this up before. Or 49:24. But all of a sudden, I'm curious about it. I read these before and think about what I'm going to talk about in these videos, but sometimes we get new insights, so we just got to go with it. And it says, but his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Okay, so they had lost trust in the God of Israel, is what it's basically referring to there. And it says it became exceedingly difficult. Yes, when you're hungry, it's difficult, right? And so he says everybody's hardened their hearts against God. It's interesting, like, that they had put their trust in this steel, this hard metal, and that is at the crux of what they're having to struggle with. But I think Nephi gives a wonderful example of what to do when we're experiencing hard times and there's hard-heartedness even amongst leaders. Like, his father is the one who should be leading, right? That's the correct order, is for the father to lead and to be a good example. But Nephi is able to inspire his father to come back to God by trusting in his leadership and gently asking him the question about where he should go. It says, and it came to pass that he did inquire of the Lord, for they had humbled themselves because of my words, for I did say many things unto them in the energy of my soul. And he said unto his father, whither shall I go to obtain food? So I think sometimes, to me, this is a feminine sort of expression, is to trust in leadership and to trust in the goodness of others to be able to do the right thing. And sometimes when we see something that we think is a difficulty, coming with the answer of, this is how it's going to happen, and this is why you're wrong, and this is what you need to do, and you need to change this, that's just going to add to hard-heartedness. But I think Nephi gives us a wonderful example of what we can do if we are suffering through a problem in an organization or in a family or in a group of people, is to go to those who have the responsibility or the stewardship to be in charge and to ask them, I'm hurting, but I've done this. What can you do with this offering that I have? So bringing his little wooden bow to his dad and asking softens his dad's heart. And says, and he goes to the Lord, and he's chastened for murmuring, and he has godly sorrow. He repents, and they're ready now to look to the Liahona to see what directions it's giving them. And he gets warnings from the Liahona, it sounds like, because he's trembling exceedingly when he sees it. And it came to pass that the pointers of the ball worked according to the faith and diligence and heed which we did give unto them. And he said there was a new writing that was plain to be read, and it told them about the ways of the Lord. And Nephi gets the instruction to go to the top of the mountain according to the directions were given upon the ball. And so he's going up to the mountain. Again, I think this is mountains in a form. I just think everything to do with an arrow. There's sort of this ball and compass like within the form of a bow and in an arrow. I can see the ball and the compass there, and he's getting sent to the mountain. So I see that arrow, I see the direction given by the ball. And it came to pass that Nephi slays wild beasts. He did obtain food for their families with his wooden bow. I think it's interesting to think about what God's able to provide with subpar resources and faith compared to like what had been higher quality or, the worldly ways of doing things. This compass was not made after the manner of man. Nephi's bow was not made after this wonderful wisdom, at the height of technology or whatever in their community. That's interesting to me. And so everyone gets some food, everyone's humbled, everyone's giving thanks to God. Things are good, so they're feeling happy again. But then Ishmael dies, the father of half of the people that are out there in the wilderness. And the daughters of Ishmael are very sad, and the sons are too, and everyone, and a lot of them start to murmur and complain again against Lehi, saying, basically we shouldn't have left Jerusalem. Our dad wouldn't have died out here in the wilderness. He was so hungry and thirsty, and we're so tired, and everything's hurting, and he died out here, and we should just go back. And they're making plans to slay Nephi and Lehi because they perceive that Nephi is trying to be their ruler and their teacher, saying, we know that he lies unto us, he tells us these things, and he worketh many things by his cunning arts, that he may deceive our eyes, thinking perhaps that he may lead us away into some strange wilderness. And after he has led us away, he has thought to make himself a king and a ruler over us, that he may do with us according to his will and pleasure. And after this manner did my brother Laman stir up their hearts to anger. I think every true leader, every true prophet seeks to bring people into the presence of God and into a knowledge of God's revelations and mysteries for themselves. And it's hard for them to understand those who would bring them to truth. I mean, we see at the beginning of this chapter that his brethren are hard-hearted, that they have a hard time understanding the things of the revelation because they don't ask. They don't have soft hearts to ask God and to really know for themselves. They're relying on what Nephi can kind of scrap by to convince them of. But I just see this tension between, do we follow Dad? Do we follow Nephi? But their unwillingness to go directly to God springs them back again and again to this place of hard-heartedness and accusatory fashion, and even seeing this idea that, hey, this guy wants to rule us and reign over us in this in this unjust way, when they actually also have it out to like kill people and tell them what to do and to want to lead a certain way. And it's interesting because you can just see this whole section is about, it references the temple. We see the slaying of wild beasts happening in the wilderness that provide the physical sustenance, but there is a raging battle in seeking to overcome the natural man. The natural man in this family has not been overcome. And so because of that, they're not able to step up and have the kind of power and conviction and clarity that a fullness of priesthood power and a full understanding of God for themselves would afford them. They're in a large sense rejecting their divine nature. They want to go back to their old traditions and their old comfortable ways of being. But as we know, the spiritual path leads people into wildernesses where they have to explore with God and leave behind the way that things have been. We need to be open and willing for God to teach us what God's traditions are or what God's way of being is. And it may be very different than what we've experienced before. And it's definitely uncomfortable. In the case of Laman and Lemuel, it's so uncomfortable that they get angry and want to kill people. They just don't want to deal with it. And it says, and it came to pass that the Lord was with us, yea, even as the voice of the Lord came and did speak many words unto them and did chasten them exceedingly. And after they were chastened by the voice of the Lord, they did turn away their anger, they did repent of their sins, insomuch that the Lord did bless us again with food, that we did not perish. So they do receive chastening words from God that keep them going. I think that it's interesting. Something that I have been noticing is that there's a difference between people. The fundamental difference between Laman and Lemuel and Nephi is that Nephi is actively seeking for answers from God, and Laman and Lemuel repeatedly have to be chastened, be told what to do. There's like this fight and this wrestle. And so to me, it's just showing a pattern of how do I want to learn my lessons from God? Do I want to learn them with more flexibility, with less suffering, with more clarity of direction? Am I willing to lay down things and not have to be so rigid about how I go about this? Or do I want to have things my way? And do I have to fight against the reality that comes when I don't want to accept, the way that things are or have been or something like that, or the way that I'm being that's preventing me from learning more? At the heart of wanting to not perish is a struggle with the natural man within us. And that's what I see in this section. But how do we overcome the natural man? With the circle and the square, with the bow and the arrow, with the mountain and the compass, through what is both just and merciful, what is both authoritative and structured and trusting of God and open to instruction. Let's see. There's a verse that I want to share because I did study a little bit about the Liahona the other day. And I was noticing in Alma 37, verse 40, that there was a particularly good insight. It says, and it did work for them, the Liahona, according to their faith in God. Therefore, if they had faith to believe that God could cause those spindles should point the way they should go, behold, it was done. Therefore, they had this miracle, and also many other miracles wrought by the power of God day by day. The thing that stood out to me in this verse was that if they had faith to believe that God could cause those spindles should point the way that they should go. So part of why we do not always have clear revelation is that we don't believe that God's speaking to us, that God will or does, and we're not even listening. And there's lots of ways to be hard-hearted, and there's lots of ways to be distracted. But if we have the faith to believe that God can communicate to us and is communicating to us, we will have a different experience with God. And there's a wonderful interview with Elder Bednar talking about personal revelation and listening to the Spirit. I'm going to post that in the show notes below as well, because I think he gives some really good insights. Sometimes we want to think that it's a process that gives us the thing, but it's really just about our relationship with God. And I think we get a special glimpse into a key principle or insight for that being able to happen is to have a mind that believes that God's talking to us. It reminds me of several chapters back where Laman and Lemuel say, God doesn't make any such thing known to us. God doesn't talk to me. Can we let that go? I think if we do, we will avoid perishing in the worst ways. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like and subscribe to this channel. I'm going to share a video on what I've learned about creating through our faith and how to strengthen our ability to use our sacred imagination in harmony with God to create wonderful things through our faith. And I'm also going to share a link to my video on casting out unbelief. If you are interested to watch those, just go ahead and click. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching.